There are today two major sites for the traditional short lyric poem as it has come down from Romanticism: establishment or MFA style writing, and rap. MFA lyrics, while never as erudite as their forebears, do model a stable ego that takes in the world and expresses. That expression, which is basically lineated prose, does not attempt to reactivate language and is wholly unambitious. Rap, for all its conformity to a stable ego and its even more traditional use of rhyme, nevertheless plays with English at each of its levels: spelling, syntax, grammar, ideation, to a degree that hasn't been seen since Chaucer. I do not mean that each rapper is a peer of Chaucer, or that any of them are his equal, but that their use of language brings out qualities of flexibility and responsiveness remarkably similar to the young English he used. The greatest experimentation takes place in drill, a hyper-violent trap subgenre invented by a Chicago teen, the brilliant Chief Keef, now 27, which in the primitive expansive drill makes him an elder. He is still prolific and still writing in the short lyric form, but has managed to extricate his work from major label control and produces in the equivalent of a small press culture for a niche and devoted following. Keef is therefore closer, in terms of the effect and audience of his work, to the avant-garde of poetry, where the short lyric has long been impossible to produce, given the tendency of this field to reject the ego as organizing principle, in favor of synthesizing a greater variety of discourses through ever more conceptual games. I read the anomaly of drill music as the grim fact that it is no longer possible to inhabit a poetic ego without inducing states of extreme paranoia and aggression, while at the same time being perforated by the imperative to advertise, clothe self, success, whatever, and that these psychic conditions yield a set of ethics counter in almost every way to those of most poetry, traditional, avant-garde, whatever stripe, written as it has been under the sign of Neoplatonism, which seeks to transcend the material world and grasp a spiritual constant by the practice of self-denial. The poets closest in ethics to rappers are Baudelaire and Archilochus, both amoral, with the latter sharing drill's bloodlust, though similarities end there. For what exactly is the relation of ethics to aesthetics, and why is poetic ego now so vulnerable to psychic distress? Drill music appeared in 2012 when smartphones had penetrated every class and age group in the country, amplifying self-consciousness to an irreversible extreme, a collective neurosis that had mortal coordinates for the child soldiers of drug traffic. Suddenly, it was possible to maintain discourse with one's enemies online, honing the language of battle that could be written, recorded, and shared through the same device that increased proximity. But even without the context of turf war, each self online quickly became hypersensitive through access to endless information, a friction of one's image with data which barely related to oneself, but that nevertheless became invested with outsized meaning because of the form of this connection, the binary person-screen. In cultures even marginally wealthier than the underclass, it was easy to feel constantly targeted, lied to, and gaslit because the conflicts resulting from incessant friction had no physical outlet and meandered in psychic games. The way out of these games, it is now clear, is self-dispersal across a collection of platforms, fandoms, and styles, producing the well-known postmodern subject: eclectic, ironic, aloof. But this escape is not available for those trapped in the underground economy, which is ruled by physical violence. The distress of self-consciousness surely weighed on Chief Keef as much as it weighed on any teenager, but the only out for him was rap, not as creative process, but as career transcendence. An escape through the performance of an ego stable enough to sing its survival, which in crucibles of gun violence like Chicago's South Side is a processual miracle. The author must tabulate threatening enemies and neutralize them with new phrases each time, threaded by announcements of success, the marriage of blood and Benjamins, and cast it all in positive terms, spontaneous enough to delight and send him forward into a future that is more or less repetitive in structure and concern. The demands of this perspective are as heavy, I would argue, as the compositional demands of the Spenserian stanza, and while they are primarily ethical, they yield an aesthetic that has considerable power to reactivate language as it is spun, which is the function of poetry. The reactivation of language always occurs as a conspiracy between words and letters against the banality of received meaning. This friendliness is illegal under normative forms of grammar and representation, which is why most rappers fail out of school. In their case, the banality of standard grammar is both useless and dangerous, for when they leave the institution of learning, its system must be cast off like a lead cloak, or else they will never be able to write what will save them. The conspiracies of rap are then waged against the menace of public space, received meaning, you will die, and the tools of prose, history disowns you. Their words and letters, pushed up against the present, become exceedingly friendly and over-relate to make it last some peace with the form of rhyme. Take the following quatrain by Sosa. Riding with the 50, smoking on the pasto. Bitch, we be having beef like tacos. He wanna be the La Famiglia, be the Vatos, but you gotta have a membership, Costco. Because none are exact rhymes, Keefe pronounces them roughly into place. He also attaches the third line to the end of the second to accommodate its extra syllables, and he pauses before the fourth to match the third's pace. The whole scans like an abacus. But the word pasto, drugs, shifts slightly toward food with tacos, and then fully into its Italian costume with La Famiglia, a term of belonging that counters the adversarial, beefy nature of tacos, which are suddenly balanced by their cultural sponsor, Vatos, and yet the delicate push and pull of allegiance is thrown off in the end with the metonymic gatekeeper and bulk alimentarian, Costco. In this way, Keefe nudges a drug term into the world of food, a food item into a mode of conflict, a chain restaurant into a possible conciliation, and a wholesale retailer into an act of closure and rejection. This level of dramatic investment is qualitatively different from a standard postmodern embrace of popular culture as a setting or texture upon which delicate conceptual games are played, as one plays chess. The concern here is not outsmarting or making the better move, but telling someone brusquely, we have an issue and you can't fuck with us. Whether or not we ever say this in our day-to-day, we probably think it 800 times in some of our most exciting thoughts. Pettiness is a wonderfully creative faculty of cognition, and perhaps the most personal. Yet in our age that is so obsessed with authenticity, we rarely follow its scent back to the cave of rudeness. It is an underdeveloped region of language, and therefore one that could be exploited, as here, to reactivate itself with common units. Notice, too, that La Famiglia is a noun, the family, which is redundant after the English the, but works as an ornamental sound within the line. It is not a neologism for belonging, but a site-specific ally. And that Costco should follow the simile construction of tacos, but doesn't, since it must catch up, as it were, to the speed of the third line. These are provisional tactics rather than rules, suggesting, as Gertrude Stein put it, that grammar is in our power. But lower than grammar, the manipulation of words is a further license Keefe takes by mumbling very precisely to rhyme things that wouldn't come close in standard spelling. The radicality of high postmodern verse is conspicuously safe when it comes to spelling, because it focuses on the intersection between multiple discourses each standard word can reveal. This stability of spelling is an unspoken power such poetry exploits to maximize its trespass across discourses that are themselves unequal. Advertising, science, fiction, the law. And the reason for this mixed allegiance comes not purely from our experience of life as fragmented and polyvalent, but also from our theoretical inheritance of postmodern critique, which has shown that claims of singularity are often hegemonic and evil. More specifically, postmodern theory is rightly suspicious of the political power of universal language. But in the case of rap, which is a singular tongue, wholeness is not power, but disenfranchisement. Black speech is that rare self-contained form that does not weaponize its unity. Lyrics in rap may be violent, but compare the violence carried out historically by its commands with the violence enacted by standard political speech. The key to this innocence is the reclamation of the N-word, an adaptation so obscene it disqualified black speech from political power, which is a kind of freedom from guilt unknown in this time of hyper-awareness and inevitable implication in systems of dominance. The cringe desire of white boys to use the N-word comes vaguely from an intuition of this freedom, which could also be described as identity safety or cultural equilibrium, as these boys are fated for unstable egos that barely have room to move across other discourses without acquiring the guilt of appropriation. Meanwhile, Keith, studded with slurs, radically increases the friendliness of ass and hare, whale and 12, to announce cryptically, "You got that macaroni ass, but you know I hate that phony hair. Baby, I'm a whole motherfucking whale. These puny, really fucking 12. Or is it cryptic? He is essentially saying, your ass is so cute, don't worry about your hair. I'll eat up these problems, including the narcs who are watching. Which grants Eros the power to allay insecurities, psychic and physical. To rule, in other words, like Bowie's heroes. In addition to Eros and pettiness, glory makes its way through the trapdoor of drill. These are affects strangely missing from or muted in conceptualism, a quiet that has long been taken for experimental bravery, as if the project of postmodern verse was to sympathize with machines. A necessary task. But if poetry is the promise that all of experience can be given to language, the pesky romantic passions of an old lyric age should return, inflected by our metal nerves, but true to what has remained of us after accelerationism. Some of the brightest minds of the 20th century, we can in retrospect say, made fools of themselves thinking of fashion as a contract beauty had made with death. Benjamin saw in mass-produced aesthetics a pace and repetition that closed the possibility of aura, which he conceived to have a dialectical relation to progress. Beauty aligned with progress was catastrophic in these terms, and his rejection of this art poisoned the lens of later theory that might have studied couture poetically. This Neoplatonic turn away from the complex materiality of beauty in late capitalism freed the space rappers eventually took up with much flourish. An artist who keeps up with fashion differs from one who doesn't in a key way. The former cannot have an elegiac relation to beauty. With few exceptions, rappers don't lament the passage of time. They have no time to lament, which is a tragic mutation of sensibility critics like Benjamin foresaw, but they could not predict that at the new speed fashion demands, the old feelings of romanticism, eros, shade, glory, like fugitives would return through a forest of hyperconsumption. LVMH is something like a refuge for 21st century humanism, which is all wrong, of course. A corporation should not be a guardian, but then, where else could rappers turn? Beauty in high verse is decidedly conceptual, while rap, as singular discourse, is unable to wield the self-denial, self-dispersal skeleton key of normal avant-garde poetics. Trapped in the lyric form, mutated by the internet, and forced to match its speed of images, could someone like Chief Keef reject fashion? Consider the proposition that language is now as pictorial as alphabetic. Many of the finest things online are written with pictures. The best rappers today, Keef included, are basically walking ideograms. Their music videos are the precise point at which words have transitioned to images. We should be able to read their Balmains as we read the Chinese characters in Pound's cantos. An acceptance of consumerism cannot neutralize these signs. It's all important. Sue me.